There have been steam locomotives of sufficient importance to warrant a video in their own right, such as the Cino's H8 Alleghenies, the Pennsylvania's Duplexes, and the Union Pacific's Big Boy. However, there was one locomotive whose design and performance were even more outstanding to me than the ones just mentioned. Yet, the recognition of its remarkable story has been overshadowed by the popular appeal of big is cool. Until now, that is. Of course, I'm talking about the Norfolk & Western Class A 2664, a locomotive that has eluded my full knowledge of it until my most recent visit to Roanoke. Today, I tackled the largest video I've done to date, one that has taken years of my research to put together. So, as always, sit back and I hope you enjoy. The Norfolk & Western by the late 1920s had become what I call a powerhouse railroad, meaning that, albeit small size, it could handle large amounts of freight and passengers comparable to the larger railways that surrounded it here in Appalachia. This was due to their most recent developments in articulation with their heavy freight locomotives, which by that time for many railroads was still what equates to a newborn child at a daycare. However, this lack of understanding did not hinder the Norfolk & Western's ability to experiment heavily with articulation, even surpassing the Chesapeake and Ohio in that regard. However, with the Great Depression and rises in costs with its mechanical and testing departments, the Norfolk & Western was stuck with what it had, and could not continue its early experiments with their Y3 and Z1 Malays. In turn, they focused on remedying their failing 442 fleet of Class J's and 462 fleet of Class E Pacifics, which were built in the very early 1900s and 1910s. The Class J 442s, having 7 of them produced in 1903, were well off for their time, having 21,751 pounds of tractive effort and 79-inch drivers being able to push speeds upwards of 70 miles per hour. Comparable to the 442s, the Class E 462s were better off, having 28,000 pounds of tractive effort, with 70-inch drivers making them hit speeds topping out at 75 to 80 miles per hour. A total of 57 were produced between 1905 and 1912, showing that the Class E was more preferred over the early J's for passenger service. However, by the time the Great Depression rolled around in 1929 and into the subsequent decade, Norfolk & Western's now aging fleet for passenger-based locomotives incited them to replace them in that service, with both the E's and early J's being retired in the mid-1930s. Until a suitable replacement was found, the newer and more powerful Class K482s took over for both light freight and passenger service. But even by the mid-1930s, the Class Ks, excluding the K3 variant built in 1926, were also aging like the locomotives they were meant to replace. However, the Norfolk & Western did not have a replacement for them, as the Ks were extremely good in dual service, so much so to where the Ks were used everywhere on the system, and nothing else was readily available to replace the Ks in the passenger part of that role. With this in mind, and the railway mostly recovered from the Great Depression, the Norfolk & Western Mechanical Department finally got the funds necessary to continue both designing newer locomotives and continue experimenting with articulation. Starting in late 1934, the Norfolk & Western Mechanical Department had begun designing a pseudo-replacement for their aging Class Ks, as well as a possible upgrade for said Class Ks to keep them in service longer. At first, they looked at other railroads and what they had done to accomplish this specific goal of, quote, dual service, and a recurring theme was noticed. Most railroads by that time, that liked the idea of dual service that is, normally had a balanced 484 Northern type locomotive, one that had the power for light to medium freight service, but also the speed to handle timed passenger trains. The mechanical department took note of this and continued to their next phase of planning a new design. Everyone knows the Class J484s, one of the most advanced and the last built steam locomotives in the United States. However, what most people don't realize is that the J's were not the first Northern to be proposed by the Norfolk and Western. Of course, I had no knowledge of this until recently when crawling my grubby, coal-laden hands through older railway documentation for this video in particular, when I came across this, the Class N, an unstreamlined Northern that, like the unstreamlined J1s later on, looked like the enlarged J3 Hudsons from New York Central. The Class N is not listed anywhere else in any Norfolk and Western documentation outside of that one design drawing in the book, the Norfolk and Western Class A, the Mercedes of Steam. Why is it not documented anywhere else? Well, heck if I know, but I have a good feeling that it got destroyed very long time ago for some reason, so we have no real documentation outside of that book. Anyways, tangent over, moving on. However, this plan of a new Northern type fell through by 1935, as the Norfolk Western higher-ups saw its power output was insufficient for the role. So, the Norfolk Western Mechanical Department went back to the drawing board, taking everything they had learned from this point, and applying it into what I believe is the best designed steam locomotive in the United States. They had originally wished to follow the Clinchfield's direction and try out a Challenger-type locomotive. However, this proved to be a bit too large of a locomotive to really fit on their tight mountainous lines, something that the Clinchfield would learn the hard way later on. Instead of copy-pasting something that was the Fitzgerald's idea of dual service, the Norfolk and Western Mechanical Department took what they liked of the Class N Northern and what they liked about their Class Y Malays and decided to combine the two, creating the locomotive of their dreams. Being designed and then having a single testbed built in late 1935 into 1936, the Norfolk and Western 2664, now dubbed the Class A, was a simple articulated design like the Challengers the mechanical department had originally wished to require. However, the Class A had notable differences in the design compared to the original idea that was developed, such as Timken roller bearings being on every axle, 70-inch drivers, and an enlarged firebox compared to anything fielded by the Norfolk and Western at that time. However, the testbed locomotive number 1200 had one major flaw that would not be fixed until after the second testbed number 1201 would be built and tested. This, of course, was the tender capacity for both fuel and water, which 1200 and 1201 were initially equipped with what I call the quote short-haul tender, being a standard 18A tender used on most smaller locomotives like the Class Z's, earlier Class Y's, and Class K locomotives. These tenders, from what I could find on them, had 18,000 gallons of water and an impressive coal capacity of nearly 30 short tons of coal. However, with the enlarged firebox and larger boiler area, the 18A tenders could not withstand long-distance and fast-paced freight trains like the testing department had wanted, much less that the Class A's were meant to handle heavy passenger service as well. To alleviate this now growing issue, the mechanical department strapped on the Class Y5's 22F tender, which had 22,000 gallons of water capacity and 35 short tons of coal, to see if providing a tender they already had would solve the problem instead of going back to the drawing board. Funnily enough, to both the testing and mechanical departments, this idea worked, and the tender capacity problem had been resolved thanks to the 22F tender. After 7 months of straining the 1200 and 1201 in testing, the Norfolk and Western higher-ups ultimately liked the Class A's, mostly due to their equilibrium between raw power and speed, and placed an order of 8 more for the class the following year, all being equipped with the 22F tender. With the arrival of the 8 more Class A's in late 1936 and 1937, the Norfolk and Western sent these powerful yet elegant locomotives to the Ohio River Valley and Blue Ridge grade to put both their power and speed to the true test. On the Blue Ridge, which was a constant 1.2% grade for 8.5 miles, the A's were more used as a support unit for the fleet of Y5s and early Y6s, with multiple photos of the A's leading the Class Ys up the grade with massive coal drags that rival today's intermodal trains in size. In the Ohio River Valley, the A's were seen alone 95% of the time, an extreme difference compared to their time on the rest of the system. With the little amount of grades in this area of the system, the A's could really stretch their legs and show their true speed potential. Although many sources state that the A's maximum rated speed is 70 miles per hour, that does not mean that the A's could not clock faster. In some very rare and documented cases, the A's topped out at 78 to 81 miles per hour in the Ohio River Valley. However, these speeds are pushing the A's frame to its extreme upper limit, so this was not recommended in standard running. No matter the case, the A's proved their worth to the Norfolk and Western, and were a valuable asset to have when the US ultimately joined World War II. With the outbreak of World War II in September of 1939, the Norfolk and Western found itself in a rather curious position, vastly different from many other railroads here in the US. With the railroad serving Norfolk Port, having multiple military bases along its routes, and acted as a bypass of DC and Baltimore, this meant that there was going to be an extreme increase in rail traffic. However, with the railroad withstanding the blow of the Great Depression a lot better than most, the Norfolk and Western was ready to handle whatever was thrown at them, wartime traffic included. Unlike many other railroads, whose motive power by this time was lacking slightly due to the sudden rise and drop in dieselation, the Norfolk and Western was well equipped with their motive power. The recent arrival of the Class J 484s were placed into the passenger service role to alleviate the Class Ks for smaller trains and for usage as military locomotives. The large fleet of Class Y 2882s did what they had always done, handle the massive freight drags that made the Norfolk and Western famous. But for the Class A's, well, they did it all. From handling large freights to high-speed military trains and even timed passenger trains, the Class A's were the epitome of, quote, dual service. However, by 1942 and 1943, with the war now ramping up in intensity, the Norfolk and Western needed more locomotives, as with many other railroads, their fleet was now starting to stretch itself thin. In early 1942, an order of 16 Class Y6As and 15 Class A's were sent to Roanoke shops, with the new Y6As being done that November and the Class A's being done by 1943. These A's, number 1210 through 1224, were noticeably different from the first batch in 1937, with the following differences being noted. The most obvious of these differences was the use of alligator crossheads and guides instead of the multiple bearing type crossheads found on the earlier A's. Included in the different crossheads, a new version of the leading truck frame was designed, with a deeper spring pocket above the roller bearing journal box. These castings became standard on later A's, with even some of the early A's getting them in later years. The one most notable difference of these A's and the later A's, however, was the use of carbon steel boilers, over the first 10 having nickel-plated boilers, which were prone to cracking. With these advances, and with the class's fantastic performance under wartime pressure, it wouldn't be long before another order of A's was sent to Roanoke shops. This order of 10 more Class A's, number 1225 through 1234, rolled out twice a month, between February and June of 1944. Keep in mind that during this time, Roanoke Shops was not only building and maintaining its own fleet of Norfolk and Western locomotives, but was also overhauling major motive power for other railroads in the process. This was due to the shop's sheer size compared to other railroads around it, with the lack of room being the main driving point. However, that sheer size was pushed to its limit during the war, nearly throwing off the delicate balance of the Roanoke Shops itself. By the war's end in 1945, the Norfolk and Western had built 20-some Class A's for its fleet, as well as multiple Class Y6As and Class J's, finally becoming what the higher-ups wished to achieve during wartime or not, a superpower railroad. While many railroads in the US after the war immediately turned to dieselation for their motive power, only a handful of railroads decided that steam was still king, and not one railroad honored this more than Norfolk and Western. With anthracite coal as its main commodity, the Norfolk and Western not only fed off of what coal is sold to industries across its routes, but also used those same mines to feed its large steam fleet. With the railroad being one of a small handful in North America to become self-sufficient on its own terms, the Norfolk and Western had reached superpower status by World War II's end in 1945. However, this new title did not stop them from their quest to continue steam to the bitter end, with the Class Ys being subject to many experiments during the final years of steam. As for the fleet of Class A's, however, not much really changed. A final batch of 8 Class A's was ordered from Roanoke shops between 1949 and 1950, with the numbers 1235 through 1242. The one notable difference in this last batch, and more specifically the last 4 Class A's, was the use of new production Timken roller bearings compared to the older ones used on the rest of the class. However, these newer A's didn't get much running time, as the twilight of steam was approaching, and even the steam-driven Norfolk Western knew that its reign as, quote, King Coal would only last so much longer. To try and extend the demise of steam on its railways, the higher-ups got with Baldwin and designed the TE-1 number 2300. The 2300, also known as the John Henry, was a very experimental coal turbine, following the path of the C&O with their M1 turbine. However, with only one being built in 1954 and its relatively lackluster performance on its own, Norfolk Western got slapped with a reality stick, and by 1957 began scrapping its prize fleet of locomotives. By 1958, with the new CEO in charge taking desolation in force, the prize steam fleet had begun its downfall. However, 4 locomotives were chosen to give one final hurrah for the entire fleet, with Class Y6B number 2174 and Class A number 1240 taking the main farewell to steam tours. Class A number 1240 started this fateful day in 1959 at Roanoke, where it would take the massive fan trip to Bluefield, West Virginia, where the 2174 would take over. Eventually, 1240 returned the train to Roanoke the following day. However, a sad fate awaited it, as 1240 was scrubbed not a few hours after the tour was ended. As for 2174, the Y6B saw continued uses until April of 1960, finally being retired for the last time, and was one of a handful of locomotives to not be retired until that point. However, 2174's story would take a brighter turn, as the NRHS was looking at acquiring her for preservation. However, this never manifested, and 2174 followed the rest of her class in 1976. However, not all steam from the Norfolk Western's glory days had been destroyed, and one large one in particular still had steam left in its boiler. Although the planned saving of Class Y6B 2174 had fallen through, the NRHS and Roanoke itself had 2 major icons still in its grasp. These, of course, were Class J number 611 and Class A number 1218. While the 611 had been kept a blind eye from the CEO at Norfolk Western, 1218 had been sold as a stationary boiler before making its way back to Roanoke in 1971, when it was on lease from the Steamtown Historic Site. By the 1980s, talks about the 1218 becoming a part of the Norfolk Southern Steam program had slowly begun arising, as the now famed 611 had been a part of the program for a few years, and Norfolk Southern wanted something bigger. By the end of 1984, the Norfolk Southern Steam program wanted to lease the 1218 to pull longer and heavier excursion trains. After some subsequent disputes took place, Norfolk Southern and Steamtown Foundation settled on a trade where the former required the 1218 and the latter received 2 EMD diesel locomotives in return. On May 10, 1985, number 1218 was then towed out of the museum and taken to the former Southern Railway's Norris Yard steam shops in Irondale, Alabama, where it would be restored to operating condition at a rough cost of $500,000. On March 26, 1987, after 2.5 years of heavy work, Norfolk Western Class A number 1218, the last 2664 left in the world, ran under his own power for the first time in 28 years. Of course, I've already covered the full story twice now, so I won't harp on it too much here. But let's just say after that fateful day, the rest was history. What? Y'all seriously think I wasn't going to mention the Root of Legends? Come on, y'all know me by now. Anyways, as someone who absolutely adores this class of locomotives, of course I was going to choose the locomotive for my series. Back in October of 2023, where the Root of Legends was still in its infancy, I had acquired an HO scale locomotive of Norfolk Western Class A. I had been on the hunt for a 1218 model for 2 years by this time, with no real luck, so I began to settle for another number of the class, hoping I would find one I would love. All of this was going down when I was tipped off about someone wanting to sell off their Class A, number 1214. Of course, I jumped into this offer like a rabid dog and traded off my CNIM 210 plus cash for this Class A. Little did I know at the time that this model would spur an entire alternate reality in of itself. Norfolk Western Class A number 1214 soon took over from my excursion roster in the model world, being the past and now current star of my fleet. However, my fragile autistic brain realized something only a few months after owning her. She could be the star locomotive for the Root of Legends. That's when it clicked and the absolutely ungodly amount of writing for this series began. No, I'm not kidding, I have a whole storage drive dedicated to just this series alone. Soon after I put 1214 as a star locomotive for the series, she had gotten a name. At the time, I wasn't too sure what name to give her, but after one faithful comment from a follower of mine, her name had been decided, and by God did it stick like super glue. Of course, y'all know the rest after this point, so just like the 1218 story, I won't harp much here on this topic either. Believe me, this video is long enough. There are many steam locomotives for which the claim, quote, they were the finest ever built, has been made. Since locomotives seldom competed against one another under controlled conditions, and few, if any, individuals had the opportunity to operate all the notable locomotives under regular service conditions, there had always been nebulous claims, and usually emotional ones at that. In the case of the Class A 2664, however, the claim can just about be as accurately proven, as close as one can be anyways, by whatever yardstick one chooses. Productivity, horsepower per pound, utility of design, etc., etc. However, the true value of any locomotive is what it does for its owner, which is its productivity. This is the only criteria that should matter when determining such a claim, and as stated before, the Class A has shown that criteria tenfold. Not only to me, but to thousands of others. I'm still Beast Norfolk and Western, and I'll see you next time.